I think under Xi Jinping, Beijing might be more willing to sacrifice sort of some short-term economic growth for sort of greater political control and greater securitization.
Do you think that at some point, if China doesn't achieve its aims through non-kinetic means, that it will resort to military force?
The biggest international risk, I would say, sort of stems from sort of the continued vagaries of U.S. foreign policy, right? With sort of the Trump administration continuing in its tendencies of bullying and intimidation.
Hi, I'm Dominic Bowen, and welcome to the International Risk Podcast, where we explore the international risks shaping global affairs and impacting businesses around the world. Today, we turn to China, whose foreign policy has undergone significant recalibration in recent years. The disruption introduced during the Trump administration marked a critical turning point, from trade decoupling and technological tension to ideological contests and institutional rivalry. The international order has certainly shifted over the last 6 months, and so too has China's strategy. So is Beijing trying to build a new global order, or is it trying to adapt and maintain leverage within the existing one? To explore this, we're joined by a leading expert on China's foreign policy and global influence campaigns. Our guest today is Dr. Audrye Wong. She's the Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California. Dr. Wong's research focuses on China's economic statecraft, global propaganda networks, and the strategic use of narrative. She's the author of a forthcoming book with Oxford University Press called Subversion and Seduction, China's Economic Statecraft. And she has held research affiliations with the Wilson Center, Brookings Institute, Harvard's Belfer Center, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She joined us today to discuss a variety of issues related to China's foreign policy, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Audrye, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thanks, Dominic. It's great to be here.
Audrye, your work has examined how China uses economic tools and narratives to project influence beyond its border. And I think we can all agree that the Trump era has disrupted many assumptions about US leadership and the international stability and the Bretton Woods Pact and how the world has really evolved over the last couple of decades. So I'm keen to hear from you about the structural changes that this has triggered in the international system at large. The Trump era's aggressive decoupling, tariffs, of course, the hostile rhetoric that Trump has been using against even his allies, but also the structural realignment that we're seeing amongst allies, friends, and foes. And then perhaps we can dive into what this means for China.
Absolutely. I mean, I think certainly in this new era, in the Trump 2.0, it's even more a continuation of the first Trump administration, where we're seeing sort of little heed to the conventional norms of global governance, of political cooperation. And I think, sort of Trump's intimidating approach to foreign policy, right, where he often tries to bully and ends up alienating many allies and partners, has provided a really good opportunity for China to reposition itself, right? Not as the revisionist or threatening rising power, but actually a contributor to the global order and a source of stability, in contrast to Washington's current moves.
Yeah, I think that source of stability has been a really, really effective narrative that certainly China's been using across Europe. And I think many European politicians and bureaucrats are listening very loudly to that. But how else has China adapted its foreign policy since Trump 2.0? And which of these disruptions has had the deepest effect on China's pre-existing strategy?
Yeah, I think you could see sort of a two-pronged approach in China's foreign policy in recent times. On the one hand, it's it's standing up more directly to what it sees as very aggressive U.S. moves in a trade war, right? It's sharpening its economic coercion toolkit. It's proven sort of more ready to use rare earth export controls, for example, right, to sort of escalate tensions and really exert pressure on the United States, and even on the European Union, right, who is not directly involved in the U.S.-China trade war. So I think we see China sharpening its toolkit. It's sort of saying, look, we've developed a whole set of frameworks, sort of modeled after, in fact, Washington's approaches to economic sanctions, and saying, oh, we can have an unreliable entity list, we can have an anti-sanctions foreign law, and we're going to sort of draw on all of these legal tools and legal frameworks and regulatory measures and say here's how we're going to retaliate against the United States, right? And so I think China is becoming much more formidable, and much more direct because Xi Jinping can't afford to look weak, right? It has to say we're standing up to what the United States is doing, and at the same time, it's doubled down on a charm offensive of sorts. I think with many other countries, especially in the global South, sort of tying to what I was saying earlier, right? Capitalizing on Trump's foreign policy moves that are often, on goals, and saying China is a provider of public goods. China is, proposing the Global Development Initiative or continuing the Belt and Road Initiative, where we want to have trade agreements, we want to continue investing in countries, and that's going to provide quote unquote win-win benefits for everybody, right? And so we care about your levels of economic development. In contrast, the United States, which is going around, fomenting instability, and sort of, pursuing wars of aggression. And so I think that's a very persuasive narrative, right? I think China has been very good at sort of combining its economic tools and its information or propaganda tools, and using that to spin a narrative where it's saying here we're building this infrastructure project, and sort of really emphasizing, right, China's presence on the ground, in contrast to U.S. withdrawal and U.S. absence.
Yeah, whether you're a Trump proponent or not, it really is hard to see many of his actions as not being own goals as you described them. It really is a shame for the US, a shame for US exceptionalism, certainly that has been achieved over the years.
I think a lot of U.S. foreign policy sort of influence, right, and reputation and power is draws from its extensive network of alliances, formal alliances as well as informal partners, and I think that's a key source of U.S. foreign policy strength, and that's something that China doesn't have, but now the United States is destroying that.
Yeah, declaring a war on everyone, including your allies, was a unique strategy, and perhaps one that Trump, and certainly if not Trump, other people in the administration may feel the pain from at some point, maybe soon. And I wonder how these changes are shaping Beijing's current global strategy. You mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, which is something we've spoken about a few times on the International Risk podcast, but also the BRICS and the BRICS Plus, and they recently had their summit. What sort of narratives are you seeing? How is China adapting its engagement across Belt and Road Initiative countries or countries that are participating in it, and also the BRICS Plus members?
Yeah, I think that China's positioning itself as an alternative leader to Washington. It's more reliable, it's less disruptive. Right now, China could be seen as the one, perhaps, in its narrative, like trying to preserve the global order, the multilateral order, the free trading order, right? Whereas Trump is the United States is the one that's sort of imposing tariffs willy-nilly and trying to extract concessions, from basically every country in the world. And so I think for many, developing countries, in Asia and in the global South, right? That's a very compelling narrative, and certainly, right. BRICS is far from a cohesive, strategic bloc, but I think, it's providing the opportunity for China again to sort of exert leadership, and saying we're here to stay, we're here to provide stability, and there could be an alternative sort of approach to the global order.
And before we continue to explore the international environment, I'd love to explore domestic issues. And President Xi's consolidation of power over the last few years, economic slowdown in China, youth unemployment, I think these are potentially shaping how China projects strength abroad. Now, we know that foreign policy isn't always just strategic. It's often a domestic performance. It's meant for domestic consumption. So I wonder to what extent you think China's foreign policy is driven by internal domestic pressures, economic slowdowns, nationalist sentiment, politics, and how does that shape Beijing's appetite for confrontation and compromise in these strategic dialogues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think that sort of internal constraints or internal factors always do play an important role in foreign policy, and certainly in China, but in the United States and other countries. I would say that, first and foremost, while under Xi Jinping, China has pursued a more um, assertive or proactive foreign policy, and sort of has grander global ambitions, right? I think when it comes down to sort of the bottom line, right, regime stability and legitimacy is always going to be the foremost goal of any domestic and foreign policy. And so I think you could sort of see, the internal economic challenges. And the desire to preserve political stability, right, as a possible constraint, right, that I think would limit China from pursuing an limited expansionist foreign policy, right? I don't think, while there's a lot of talk about a war in the Taiwan Straits, I don't think Xi Jinping is going to recklessly initiate an invasion, right, without adequate premeditation and calculations and sort of how that fits into Beijing's broader strategy, right? Because that's a war that it doesn't want to lose. And I think China is more interested in thinking about other measures short of war, influence operations, disinformation tactics, propaganda, ways that it could sort of shape the strategic environment, right, to its advantage. So I think, this is a China that has ambitions, but, is relatively cautious. I think under Xi Jinping, Beijing might be more willing to sacrifice sort of some short-term economic growth for sort of greater political control and greater securitization, but I don't think it's sort of going to go into the other extreme where we're going to see sort of very revolutionary, very needlessly reckless foreign policy move.
Well, we'll definitely come back to your comments on Taiwan. But when you look at the domestic issues that really are potentially going to impact stability and political cohesion within China, what do you see as the biggest risks domestically in China?
I think it's a challenge of continuing economic growth, right? We've seen growth really slow down in the last several years, and there are concerns about overcapacity. Even in industries like the EV industry, right, where China is really seen as a global leader and has been quite successful, right, at pursuing industrial policies in these strategic sectors. We see a lot of overcapacity, a lot of sort of cutthroat price competition between EV companies. And so I think there are many sort of macro structural challenges that Xi Jinping and the Chinese leaders have to deal with, right? And given that a key pillar of regime legitimacy has always been delivering economic growth and economic performance, right, as a justification for keeping its hold on power, I think letting too much discontent, fester, where we see sort of talk about the younger generation, right, using the phrase tongping, like, sort of laying flat and sort of, giving up in some sense, right? Like they're striving so hard, but things are going nowhere, right? And sort of that sense of malaise is not something that the CCP wants to permeate through its population. So I think sort of ensuring that, whatever political moves it doesn't fundamentally jeopardize sort of that trajectory of economic growth, and trying to ensure that the industrial policies that it's pursuing, right, does actually allow China to move up the value chain successfully. I think those would be key in ensuring long-term stability and success from the CCP's perspective.
And there's a lot of discussion about the AI race and whether America or Europe or China is potentially going to win, if that is something that can be won or lost, the AI race. When you look at the industrial policies and when you look at economic stability and economic growth in China, do you feel confident on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party that they will be able to maintain a reasonable level of economic growth and be able to move up the value chain in the coming years and decades?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I don't want to be the final word in it, but I would say that China has proven, that it is able to sort of mobilize resources at large scale, through its political system, and incentivize, local governments, provincial governments, to sort of jump on the bandwagon and say, yeah, we're going to invest in electric vehicles, we're going to invest in wind and solar manufacturing. We're going to invest in semiconductors. And so I think by and large that China has made a lot of impressive progress, right? We've seen sort of it announce advances in chip manufacturing technology, for example, And certainly sort of the electrification of the auto industry in China, I think is quite impressive. So it has worked for the CCP so far. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges where you're throwing in there's waste, there's sort of some inefficiencies, but I think it has allowed China to move up the value chain, more and achieve its goals of self-sufficiency quite successfully. I think there will be sort of a tipping point, right, where you have to balance that with sort of more streamlining, more efficiency, reduce corruption. I think the Chinese government is trying to do that, and so it is sort of let's see how that goes in the next few years and whether it's able to achieve that balance, while stimulating, I think, domestic consumption, and ensuring sort of continued consumer confidence in its own economy.
And you've written about China's strategic use of propaganda and narrative, and you mentioned that earlier on. And today we're seeing Beijing, I think, pair soft power narratives around this non-interference and mutual respect, which is a long-standing ASEAN trait. But we're also seeing it paired with infrastructure investments and diplomacy. How are you seeing China leverage the narrative and legitimacy with economic power across the global south?
Yeah, certainly. I think in continents like Africa, for example, right, this is this sort of easy way for China to step in and say, look, we don't have the same legacy of colonialism and exploitation that Western countries have had. We're here to offer you, these loans with quote unquote no strings attached, right? We're not trying to say we're not like the IMF or the United States, who try to impose sort of governance reform or some level of regime change and adaptation in line with what they see as Western standards and norms. And so I think many elites, many political leaders in those countries are quite happy to say, yep, we're going to take these loans with fewer constraints. And so I think it sort of positions China as a credible alternative, right? Where is not burdened by legacies of colonialism. And I think that's again effectively positioning China as an alternative leader in providing these public goods and sort of saying we're here to be, to provide win-win benefits. And we're not going to interfere in your internal affairs. We're not pursuing hegemony, and that can be very appealing to these political leaders who are not always, enamored with the idea of democracy per se, and maybe more focused on, delivering economic development and growth. Of course, I want to say that China does impose other forms of political conditionality, right? There is sometimes expectation of political alignment, right, or at least sort of silence or acquiescence on issues that the Chinese government cares about. So in that sense, there are strings attached in other more subtle ways. But I think on the surface, right, if you have a leader sort of taking a loan in the short term, right, the sort of narrative that China is spinning, I think can be quite attractive and quite persuasive.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, win-win benefits, non-pursuit of hegemony. I mean, these are compelling narratives that are hard to argue against. And I think as China's been expanding its footprint in the Middle East and North Africa, combining infrastructure investments, diplomatic engagement, and security cooperation at the same time as the US influence is declining across Middle East and North Africa. I think the Pew Research did some global surveys earlier this year and found that 41% found that China was the world's leading economic power compared to 39% of respondents who said that US was the world's leading economic power. So I wonder what this tells us about people's perceptions of the world order and whether China is now the economic superpower ahead of America, or whether this is just a byproduct of seeing more infrastructure projects in your country being the country of the respondents.
I think it does show that China has the reputation or is perceived as sort of now the major economic player, especially as the United States is sort of becoming less active in foreign aid, right, with the shuttering of all its sort of aid institutions, to the extent that China is seen as the global economic player, right, building infrastructure investments, providing foreign aid, although its terms are not as always as generous as the World Bank or sort of other Western donors, and that paired with sort of the strategic narratives and the propaganda that we're talking about, right? When China builds an infrastructure project. It has a ribbon cutting ceremony, and it sends its Chinese ambassador to the ceremony. And the Chinese ambassador writes an op-ed in the local newspaper, right? And so there's so much publicity and credit claiming involved in China's economic presence, right? That it sort of reinforces the perception that China is the major economic player, and that it's here to stay, right? And I think part of that is true, but part of that is amplified by the strategic use of its global propaganda machine and propaganda apparatus, to the extent that, anecdotally, I hear, elites in Southeast Asia or in many developing countries, right, have the misperception, right, that China is the leading provider of infrastructure, of aid, when actually it's Japan or maybe Australia or the United States, right? These other donors or investors, right, aren't as good as at basically claiming credit for what you're doing. And I think that's sort of reinforcing the cycle where China is seen as the indispensable economic player, and that has, I think, allowed it to exert economic pressure or sort of dangle economic carrots, for its geopolitical gain.
Are we seeing any signs that Beijing's influence via infrastructure lending and trade imbalances is facing resistance, either around debt concerns or these no strings attached that actually do include constraints or expectations, or perhaps other issues that are upsetting partner countries? And if so, how is China managing their reputational risk when partners are beginning to question its motives or the terms of these partnerships?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is not to say, sort of, when talking about China's successes, right, that everything has been a smooth road and smooth sailing. I would say the Chinese government has certainly met with a lot of pushback, a lot of skepticism over the years, since it's launched its, first iteration of the Belt and Road Initiative. In my book and a lot of my research, I look at sort of the sources of this pushback, right, and that comes from corruption scandals, from sort of, Chinese companies and Chinese officials sort of promoting mega infrastructure projects that are not very economically feasible, that involve a lot of bribes and kickbacks to local politicians and government officials, that bypass or try to circumvent, basically, sort of legal processes like environmental regulations and approval, or approval through to the legislative body. And so I think all of that, actually, especially in the first few years after the BRI was launched or announced in 2013, right, led to a lot of pushback. Scandals. We sort of see the incumbent prime minister in Malaysia losing office, right, because of these corruption scandals involving Chinese financed infrastructure projects. We see pushback in the Philippines, sort of similar dynamics, in South Asia, in the Maldives, for example. And so I think that there definitely soured a lot of sort of perceptions on public attitudes on Chinese investments. I think, especially in countries, right, where there is at least some level of rule of law and public accountability, and where political leaders do have to care about breaking the law, right, and they do face consequences. So I think that posed a lot of challenges for China. I mean, to its credit, in the last few years, the Chinese government has attempted to rhetorically and in some on some levels, sort of, from a policy perspective, I think, try to reform and repackage and recalibrate its approach to economic investment, sort of emphasizing transparency, clamping down on corruption, streamlining projects to be more economically feasible. Now they have a tagline, small yet beautiful, to sort of market a lot of its investment projects. And I think, of course, it's a big ship to turn around. That's not to say all Chinese projects now are not, don't have any issues, but I think it has helped to sort of, regain some of that reputation, and still kept countries sort of interested in having Chinese investment in China, sort of closer economic ties with China.
That's a great line. Small yet beautiful. Who doesn't want to receive that in investment support? You mentioned earlier that President Xi won't recklessly launch an attack on Taiwan. Instead, will rely on disinformation and information campaigns. We've seen the continued employment of sustained coercive tools as well as increased military signalling in the Taiwan Strait and across the South China Sea, but no major escalation, despite many people warning of increased likelihood of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in or around 2027. How do you see that Beijing is using military posturing as part of its broader foreign policy, and how should we interpret its restraint or aggression in security flashpoints?
Yeah, I would say that sort of, the military dimension is certainly complementary, right, to sort of the other parts of its toolkit of or its statecraft, right? The economic statecraft, economic influence dimension, the sort of informational propaganda, disinformation realm. I mean, I think certainly, it behooves Beijing to sort of continue military modernization, to sort of ramp up its military capabilities to show that, it can credibly invade or attack Taiwan, or at least pose enough of a threat, right? That Washington should be concerned about that scenario, while at the same time really sort of doubling down on sort of diplomatic isolation of Taiwan, more globally, right? Trying to peel away its very few diplomatic allies, again with economic agreements and sort of economic statecraft tools to sort of get countries to remain silent on Taiwan or to sort of tacitly acknowledge. And I think sort of the level of economic interdependence that many countries have with China, right, has limited, right, many of these governments' interest, their willingness and ability to sort of speak up vocally on the Taiwan contingency, with the exception of a very few number of close U.S. allies. So there's the military, there's the economic, and then again, sort of going back to the propaganda information front, we see sort of a lot of political warfare going on in Taiwan, trying to reshape sort of the population's attitudes, to induce a perception that the U.S. is not a reliable partner, that reunification with mainland China is inevitable, um, and also sort of continue pushing that narrative, right, to many companies, right, that, oh, you don't want to get involved in this, right, that's going to be very costly to you, right. And I think that has definitely sort of shaped the international environment, right, that many actors both at the governmental level and in the business realm, right, been really cautious of sort of crossing this red line on Taiwan.
I'm going to ask a difficult follow up question, which you'll probably not like. But I wonder if you're willing to sort of read the tea leaves or read the crystal ball, and sort of how do you expect the issue of reunification of Taiwan to evolve over the next couple of years? Do you think that at some point, if China doesn't achieve its aims through non-kinetic means, that it will resort to military force, or do you think that's just not something that's going to occur?
Well, as an academic, we never like to predict the future, partly because we're, often wrong. But I mean, I think that's a really tough question. I mean, I would just say that I think China's preference would certainly be to first to use these non-kinetic means, and whittle away resolve and undermine deterrence. I don't think China sees sort of necessarily a closing window of opportunity. I think it feels that in some ways that the status quo is manageable, and if the U.S. doesn't do anything extreme, and then it wouldn't have to feel pressure to respond accordingly, and so that sort of could be a modus vivendi. I think over the at least the short to medium term. So I think the barrier for China actually using military force and launching an invasion across the Taiwan Straits, would be would be very high, and would be quite unprecedented.
Well, that's good news. I think that's what everyone wants to hear. So thanks for that, Audrey. I appreciate that on behalf of many people listening. But we still do hear that China is challenging the liberal international order. But I wonder if Beijing is really truly trying to replace the existing international system, or simply just position itself more advantageously within the existing frameworks. I mean, at the 2025 BRICS summit, China led calls for de-dollarization and proposed a global AI coordination body, which sounds great. But I'm not convinced that these are necessarily serious institutional alternatives, or merely just strategic pressure points designed to gain leverage within the existing system. So what do you see as the signals or institutional behaviors that might tell us which way the compass is pointing about? Does China want to create new systems and structures, or just better position it within the existing system?
I mean, I would say definitely China isn't a revisionist power in the sense of the Mao era, in Mao Zedong era revolution, right? That's trying to intervene overseas and overthrow regimes in the service of pure ideology. I mean, China has certainly benefited hugely from the current global order, right? Especially in terms of economic development and globalization. But at the same time, it is definitely trying to reshape the global order to favor its interests and preferences. So I think to the extent that it can do that without necessarily overthrowing the order, I think that that would be its preferred approach, right? And I think we see that taking a form of both, modifying existing frameworks and institutions. For example, we see China, especially in recent years, really trying to gain influence and assert leadership in multilateral international institutions like the United Nations, right? Through a mix of sort of personnel, sort of getting Chinese people to sort of head important positions, and certainly through money, right, through funding many of these organizations and subcommittees. And I think that has actually been quite influential in propagating and perpetuating sort of Chinese presence, and Chinese influence in these institutions, and that's going on at the same time as these creation of alternative or additional institutions like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRI, the Global Development Initiative, sort of announced by Xi Jinping in recent years in tandem with the grand sounding Global Security Initiative and the Global Civilizational Initiative, where it's again, sort of positioning itself as an alternative leader, right? Not replacing the United States. I don't think China wants to replace the United States and be sort of the public goods provider and hegemon, right? I think it's still fundamentally trying to use multilateral institutions to pursue its own interests and protect its own priorities. But I think we will see China sort of trying to both modify existing frameworks and create additional institutions, I think, as a way to assert its relationship. And I think that started before current sort of volatility, I guess, in US foreign policy, and but is certainly continuing and ramping up today.
So it's an interesting question. If I heard you correctly, that China doesn't want to replace the USA, but at the same time, China does have long term ambitions to assert itself as a great global power to reshape the international order in its favor. At the same time as managing complex relationships with the USA, with Russia, with the neighboring countries. What do you see as China's long term ambitions, and how does its current foreign policy reflect that?
I think it wants a global order that basically does allow China to do mostly what it wants, right? It's sort of talked about reclaiming discourse power, right? And it's pushing back against what it sees as the hegemony of sort of Western criticism and unfair discourse, right, around China's foreign policy and its interests. So I think it wants a world that is safe for it to do what it wants in Taiwan, to assert its claims over Taiwan, to continue its sort of policies on Xinjiang, for example, on Hong Kong, without facing much pushback from the international community. And so that requires. I mean, it's fundamentally, I think, still about China and its own interests, right, and about preserving its regime stability and legitimacy, right? So I think it's a Leninist authoritarian regime that is, somewhat paranoid, right? So I think sort of fundamentally reducing criticism, reducing pushback, having greater freedom to sort of pursue what it sees as core interests, I think, is the long term goal of the Chinese regime.
And so we've sort of talked around it quite a lot during the conversation, but China's foreign policy sometimes feels a bit like a paradox potentially, that you've got this bold institution building, but then quite cautious when it comes to kinetic or direct confrontation. My understanding is that Chinese and even Russian strategic thinking differs from Western strategic thinking in terms of philosophy, approach, and maybe even application. Just because of the cultural, historical, and ideological foundations. Can you help us understand how Beijing internally assesses and interprets international risk, and where do you see the line between its ambitions and constraints, and what risks is China willing to take in pursuit of this, and which ones do you think China is just simply not willing to take?
I mean, if China sees it as a threat to its hold on power, the Chinese Communist Party, excuse me, right? Not China generally, but the Communist Party sees it as a threat to its hold on power, right? I think it's more likely to take greater risks, right? And maybe one example is we sort of see a shift in China's approach to global propaganda, where it really started adopting the Russian disinformation playbook and started becoming sort of more active and using sort of some of these more uh, aggressive tactics, right? And intercepting accounts, sort of really spreading, right, false rumors and fake news and making things up, right? And that shift, I think, really came right when post COVID pandemic, post Hong Kong pro democracy protests, right? And I think these two events, right, were seen as really threatening to CCP's holding power, right? COVID was sort of questioning the government's ability to deal with an internal health crisis and with accusations of cover up and everything, and needed to show that it has has things under control, that it's doing a good job. And then certainly, of course, Hong Kong, right, where you have democracy protests. That's again undermining regime stability and Beijing's claims, over Hong Kong. And so I think that spurred right a sort of a shift in its mindset to disinformation and propaganda more broadly, and we see that carrying forward to I think it is compared to a few years ago. I think it's more likely to get involved in contentious issues in the United States and spread disinformation about local issues, sort of getting involved in anti-Asian hate crimes, sort of amplifying some of these social and political fissures in a lot of these in the United States and other countries. And so I think that's just one illustration, I think, of when it sees a risk, that it's willing to adapt its playbook, especially when it touches on the regime's hold on power.
Thanks for explaining that, Audrey. And I'd love to wrap up by, we recognize that one side is risk, but the other side is opportunity. And I think a critical area where we can see both sides really clearly is around technology. And much of the attention between China's relationships with other states is focused on the global south. But Beijing is also pursuing significant scientific collaboration and emerging technology partnerships with the global north as well. Now, we know there's export controls, chip sanctions, decoupling rhetoric, but Chinese institutions are still finding ways to plug into high value research networks, into tech ecosystems. So I'd love to hear from you about how China is using technology and scientific partnerships to strengthen its ties with countries in the global north, despite restrictions and decoupling from some actors.
Yeah, certainly. I think China still sees itself as having benefited a lot, right, from such technological collaborations. Sometimes unevenly, right, because there are definitely sort of issues of IP theft and other ways that China might have tried to sort of benefit from, technology innovation in the global north in an uneven playing field. But I think the Chinese government and Chinese companies do recognize that they have benefited from these interactions, and it is in their incentive right now, right, as they're trying to catch up, as they're trying to surpass the U.S. and other countries, and has already, right, in many other fields like EV batteries, for example, that it is an incentive to pursue that collaboration. And I think dangling the lure of the Chinese market, right, has always been a very effective tool for China to sort of keep many multinational companies coming back, right? It's hard to resist, right? And sort of anecdotally, right, if you're in a room with the leader of the head of Volkswagen or German auto companies, right, they've been known to say, like, we recognize that what we might be kicked out of Chinese market in the long term, but we're still sort of trying to double down and get as much short-term gains as we can, right? And so they're sort of like a frog in a boiling pot of water, but not wanting to jump out until they really have no option. And so I think in that way, China can leverage a lot of these companies, right, a lot of these economic relationships to, in a way, circumvent and undermine, right, the U.S. government's efforts at restricting sort of tech transfer to China, at imposing export controls on chips, for example, right? Where we see recently the head of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, right, made a very much publicized visit to China and spoke really highly about Chinese economy and the state of its technological innovation, right? And he was successful at lobbying, right, the Trump administration to reverse the recently imposed restrictions on the H20 AI chips, and it'll sort of re-allow them to be exported to China. So I think it has been a very good way for China to sort of leverage such diplomacy to say, like, to tell companies, look, we still want to cooperate, and that undermines sort of the United States efforts, right, at sort of strengthening national security and minimizing risks and vulnerabilities in the long term.
Great. Thanks for unpacking that for us. And the final question we always wrap up with on the International Risk podcast is I'd love to hear from you, Audrey, about when you look around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
The biggest international risk, I would say, sort of stems from sort of the continued vagaries of U.S. foreign policy, right? With as sort of the Trump administration continuing in its tendencies of bullying, of intimidation, of basically reversing longstanding, foreign policy approaches that have worked, right? I think the biggest risk is sort of the breakdown, not because of the loss of U.S. leadership or reputation per se, but that sort of does leave a void where the international order becomes much less certain, becomes much more unstable. There are a lot more opportunities for bad actors to come, for Russia to sort of consolidate, right? It's holding Ukraine, for example, for China to step in and pursue its own interests, unchecked. And so I think, many, I guess you could say many of these other risks, sort of secondary risks, stem from this fundamental risk where the United States, no longer becomes a constructive and contributory, global player.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for explaining that, Audrey. And thanks very much for coming on the International Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a fun discussion.
Well, that was a really insightful discussion today with Dr. Audrey Wong, and it has really illuminated some of the strategies behind China's foreign policy. Audrey is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California. And she's the author of the upcoming book, Subversion and Seduction, China's Economic Statecraft. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Caterina Mazzucchelli. I'm Dominic Bowen. Thanks for listening to the International Risk Podcast, and we'll speak again next week.